was, okay, Lusitania sunk, boom, America's in the war. But it was 2 full years. When President Wilson finally asked Congress, he never once mentioned the Lusitania.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yvonne Hunter, and I'm the head of programming here at the Appel Salon at the Toronto Public Library. On May 1st, 1915, a luxury ocean liner sailed out of New York bound for Liverpool. The passengers were anxious. Germany had declared the seas around Britain a war zone. U-boats lurked beneath the surface. But the Lusitania was one of the era's great transatlantic greyhounds, and her captain placed great faith in previous strictures of warfare that for centuries had kept civilian ships safe from attack. Germany, however, decided to change the game. There is arguably no one better suited to telling this tale than Erik Larson, a master of narrative nonfiction and the author of 4 international bestsellers, including In the Garden of Beasts, which documents the American presence in pre-war Nazi Germany, and The Devil in the White City, a horrifying account of a serial killer lurking at the edges of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Tonight, Mr. Larson will be interviewed by Canadian journalist, broadcaster, and novelist Linden Macintyre, himself a chronicler of the story that lurks beneath the story. Mr. Macintyre is the author of 3 best-selling novels and 2 works of nonfiction. He has won 10 Gemini Awards, an International Emmy, and numerous other prizes for writing and journalistic excellence, including the 2009 Scotiabank Giller Prize. He's well known to Canadians as the co-host of the CBC's investigative news magazine, The Fifth Estate, a role he held for 24 years. And now, please join me in welcoming Erik Larson and Linden Macintyre.
There was 1,959 people on the ship. It's a few hours outside of the destination. One of those people on the ship is carrying a priceless copy of a Dickens story, The Christmas Carol.
Spoiler alert.
And priceless, never mind all the money and the people, a priceless prints of Thackeray's drawings for Vanity Fair. And I kept hoping they were going to make it. I kept saying, surely they're going to make it with all those people. I kept forgetting that it was a work of history. So they almost did make it, though, didn't they? I mean, right up, you had me fooled right up until the captain of the submarine shot the torpedo.
To say they almost made it, kind of not, maybe really, no. But I get what you mean. I mean, really, it was a confluence of, really a collection of really bizarre forces that coalesced that day in the Irish Sea to make this thing come to pass at a time when even people aboard the ship believed that they were out of harm's way. So yeah, I mean, as the reader, you had exactly the right reaction, which is, please don't let this ship sink, so.
Now, I kept, the Captain Schweiger fires the torpedo, and I say, you know what? It's a nice day. They can see it coming. All they got to do is, hard astern or hard to starboard, and he's going to miss, because he actually miscalculated the speed of the ship.
That was one of the many kind of odd things that happened that day to cause this really somewhat darkly miraculous event, was that even though the ship had set itself up in a perfect way for Schweiger to hit it with a torpedo, he had actually miscalculated its speed. So even though this torpedo hit the sweet spot, the absolute perfect place in the hull, that's not what he was aiming for. So that's one other element of the story.
They did see it coming. Passengers saw this thing.
Saw it coming.
It was a beautiful day.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that really I found very, very striking about the whole incident. First of all, let me just say that, I mean, I went into this thinking that I knew enough. I knew about the Lusitania, that, this is like, okay, ship gets hit by a torpedo, America enters the war, end of story. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there were all these really interesting elements associated with it that were just really sort of remarkable, including the fact that this day, May 7th, 1915, off the south coast of Ireland, had been the heaviest fog, and then suddenly the fog miraculously lifted.
You see, this is one of the factors that I thought would get them through. They're coming through the fog. I'm
Right.
saying, please, fog, stay.
Fog was a protection against submarines in that era. But here the fog suddenly lifted, and it was the most beautiful of days, beautiful, warm, clear, sunny day. The sea was preternaturally calm. Everybody commented on that. It was like a blackboard or a billiard table, all the usual sort of comments about what the sea was like. And then suddenly, if you can imagine yourself on the deck of this thing, right? You're walking along, you think you're home free, the Irish coast is visible 12 miles off in the distance, it's gleaming green on this beautiful May day. Then you look off to the side, off to the starboard side, and you see this track in the water coming toward the ship. And it was a very striking moment for those who saw it, and many, many had the occasion of seeing it.
It's possible that it was such a beautiful day. They were so close to shore, Ireland, that were miles away, and they were practically at the destination, that there seemed to be a sense of disbelief even when pieces of the ship were flying up.
No, true. There was a real, like one character was standing at the rail, and a woman came up next to him and said, "Is that a torpedo?" And he couldn't answer. He just felt heartsick, because sure enough, it was. On the other hand, there was also, this being 1915, there was also another guy who went to the rail when he saw the track, leaned over the rail so he could watch the impact. He could watch the impact, and he commented that it was that the torpedo coming toward the ship through this still water with the green body of the torpedo and not the phosphorescent, but the phosphorescence of the compressed air bubbles coming off the torpedo. He described it as being very, very beautiful.
And then it hits. They realize something awful has happened, and then there's 18 minutes before the bow touches the sea bottom, and there seems to be in those 18 minutes a kind of a sense that we're still going to be okay among a lot of these people.
Well, there was still a pervasive belief that the ship was so big, so well built, that this one torpedo could not possibly sink it. In fact, that was the message that was communicated to passengers by officers on the bridge, including apparently Turner. But of course, part of that was the belief structure of the time that nobody could really get it that this could possibly be happening.
I love this description that you have here of Margaret Mackworth. She was one of the survivors, and she wrote later that people moved gently and vaguely. They reminded one of a swarm of bees who do not know where the queen has gone.
Yeah, it was a lovely passage that she wrote about that. But yeah, there was a sense of disbelief. In fact, at one point, two officers were pacing on the top deck, smoking cigarettes, having come to the conclusion that nothing was going to happen to the ship, that all was fine. And then, of course, things began to degrade rather rapidly after that. And
then the ship is lost. And this is where I really start to wonder about a lot of the politics and a lot of the decisions that were made. I mean, there was a very large British warship set sail, a very fast ship. It could have been there very quickly, and then it turned back. Why was that?
So he's talking about
the Juno,
relatively obsolete armed cruiser called the Juno, which was in Queenstown in the port. And after Lusitania sank, and there were countless people in the waters around the ship in the sea at 55-degree temperatures. The question was, how do you get rescue craft out there fast enough? The ship was, while only 12 miles from the Irish coast, it was 24 miles or so from Queenstown, now called renamed Cove, but at the time it was known as Queenstown. 24 miles. Well, you think about 24 miles, you think that doesn't sound like so much, but then when the typical speed of a vessel in that era, and I'm not talking about sailing craft, because sailing craft could not make any headway because the day was so still. But the other ships were going at about typically like around 8 knots. You know, that's suddenly you're talking about 3 hours minimum to get to the site. But here was this cruiser, the Juno, which was capable of 18 knots, could have gotten there very quickly, and in fact was initially ordered out to try to rescue passengers, but then was recalled. Now, that at first seems utterly criminal and without justification. And yet, the Admiralty felt it had justification for that because of something that happened relatively early in the war. You know, the submarine, we lose sight of this now, the submarine was a brand new phenomenon in World War I. Nobody understood the submarine, not even the navies that dispatched them. And so early in the war, you know, nobody thought they would ever be terribly effective as an offensive battlefield, you know, at sea naval weapon. But early in the war, a single submarine attacked and in short order sank 3 armed cruisers, and was able to do so because it sank the first, all the men went into the water. The second and third cruisers all stopped to try to rescue people from the initial ship, thereby setting themselves up as terrific targets for the submarine commander, who then picked them off one by one. The immediate result of this, apart from an appalling number of dead young sailors, most of them cadets, was that the Admiralty decided, henceforth, ordered that no large British warship would be allowed to stop to pick up survivors of submarine attacks. And that's why the Juno was recalled.
From the first time I ever heard of the Lusitania was on a bubblegum card. And from that time forward, and I think this has been reinforced by a lot of commentators, it was the incident that propelled the United States into World War I. And yet, it wasn't really, was it? It took another...
Well, that was one of the things that appealed to me when I started just reading initially about the Lusitania, was all the things all the mythology that had built up around the event. Like I, for one, having grown up in, you know, obviously in America, on Long Island, and going to high school there, and having my high school European, you know, history course, and, you know, all I took away was, okay, Lusitania sunk, boom, America's in the war. And then you go on, and it's like on a timeline. It's this geopolitical event. There it is, done, end of story, right? But then, you know, and in fact, as I was doing my research, I would ask members of my family and anybody who else, friends and so forth, who knew I was working on this project. I'd say, so what do you think? I mean, without first Googling the answer. I mean, what do you think? How long do you think it took between the time the ship sank and the time America got into the World War? And the estimates ranged from 2 days to 2 months. But it was 2 full years. 2 full years. And not only that, when President Wilson finally asked Congress, U.S. Congress, to intervene, for a declaration, not so much of war, but of declaration acknowledging that a state of war already existed between Germany and America, he never once mentioned the Lusitania, because so many other things had happened in the interim, including German submarine attacks against American flag ships.
Now the British, and this is where it gets kind of spooky, the British were not happy about that 2-year lag. There was a presumption in the British Admiralty that this was the incident. There was one prior incident where they thought the Americans would retaliate, and the Americans didn't. The conspiracy theory is almost irresistible that the Lusitania was left hanging out there as a target of opportunity, and as a potential provocation that would draw the Americans into the war, because the British desperately did want them in there. Where do you?
Well, that's the conspiracy theory. And what's interesting about that is that there is a lot of evidence. That, first of all, there is no smoking memo, if you will. There's no memorandum from Churchill saying, okay, let's set up the Lusitania, or from anybody in the Admiralty, at least none that I found, and none that any other historian has found either. But Rather, there is a collection of evidence on the subject of why, on the subject of the Lusitania being left alone in the Irish Sea in harm's way. It's a collection of evidence that if you look at it, it will not absolutely prove that there was a conspiracy to sink the Lusitania, to let the Lusitania go into these waters and fall in harm's way. At the same time, if you reverse that approach, the way a scientific lab, somebody doing scientific lab research might do to prove the Newell hypothesis, if you use the same evidence and you try to prove that there was not a conspiracy, you can't. That's the thing. That's the interesting thing. That's why it still lingers in people's minds. Why was this ship allowed to be in those waters without protection, without being diverted, and so forth? One of the most interesting elements that I came across was there was a quite prominent British naval historian, former member of British naval intelligence, who initially, when he did a book about this kind of thing, when he was dealing with the Lusitania, he put it up to, as he put it, a monumental cock-up. It was a mistake. It was a snafu. Later in life, this same historian changed his mind, and he talks about it in an interview that is on file in the Imperial War Museum in London. And in this interview, he says that because of other evidence that had come out as well, again, no smoking memo, but other evidence that had come out as well, he came to the conclusion later in his life that there was no other explanation, that there had to have been a conspiracy of some kind. What kind exactly? Who was behind it? He had no idea. So it's tantalizing.
Because
I lay it on the naval historian.
He said there was a plot,
yeah.
and it was based on the fact that this famous British Admiralty intelligence operator, Room 40, tracked this submarine all the time. It knew exactly where it was. It knew where it was in proximity to the Lusitania. And they did nothing.
This is another one of the elements of the story that definitely was not taught to me in high school, and that is that there was at the time this super secret intelligence division within the Admiralty, Room 40, that was set up very early in the war to take advantage of three nearly miraculous events: the recovery in three different manners of Germany's three most important code books, naval and diplomatic. Because these things had come into Britain's possession, the decision was to establish Room 40. It was a very, very, very secret operation. Churchill and a handful of others knew of its existence. And Room 40's mission was to use these code books to help decode intercepted German naval wireless communications. And they got so good at it that the result was that Britain, the Admiralty, was reading virtually every German naval wireless transmission for most of the war, including details about the comings and goings of submarines, one of which was U-20, commanded by Captain Schwieger. And Room 40 knew exactly when the submarine left on that particular fateful patrol, knew exactly when it left Germany, knew exactly the route it took for the first 24 hours because the wireless man in the ship sent 14 different position reports back to his base. And they, more importantly, Room 40 knew exactly the patrol zone to which the submarine and Captain Schwieger were assigned, and that patrol zone was right off Liverpool Harbor, which is where not only the Lusitania, but every other Cunard liner or merchant vessel and every other vessel entering the western approaches was going to pass through.
See, the British were notoriously protective of their intelligence, and they didn't want the Germans to know they had all this and that they had cracked the codes, but it would have been perfectly normal to send out an escort. And they didn't.
They had, in fact, on past occasions, they had sent escorts for ships deemed to be facing a submarine threat. Cunard liners that, were carrying, in some cases, munitions. So they were particularly motivated to do it. But in this case, even though several destroyers actually were available, there was no effort to provide an escort, no effort to divert the ship into Queenstown, no effort also to turn the ship onto, to divert it to a newly opened and much safer route called the North Channel route.
So the naval historian Beasley says there was a plot, and he's a Brit. What does the historian Erik Larson say?
The historian Erik Larson says that I'm hanging it on Beasley. That's what I'm saying. No, truly. I mean, there's a gentleman who had spent much of his life studying and writing about British naval history, and the fact that it was good enough for him to change his mind, I found very, very convincing. But again, I come back to the idea that the evidence is sufficiently strong and there that you cannot disprove the theory that there was a conspiracy, nor can you absolutely prove, as if in a court of law, that there was a conspiracy. So it's something of a conundrum.
So 1,200 almost died. 128 of them, I think, were Americans.
Americans, yeah.
And I had the impression reading this book, I mean, it's in the same sense, and it was a complete suspension of my knowledge, that maybe they'll make it. And I had a sense that I knew all those people. And I have to ask you, how do you create suspense and drama in nonfiction when the reader probably knows how it's going to end?
Well, yeah, it's like, yeah, you don't want to give away the ending, but it's like, that's what drew me to the subject in the first place. Once I'd sort of learned also all the things that I didn't know, but what really drew me, what I felt I could bring to the party, right? Something I felt I could bring maybe new to the historiography of the Lusitania, was this element of suspense, that I could put on my Hitchcock hat and in a nonfiction realm, turn this into essentially a maritime thriller. And the reason I felt I would be able possibly to do that is because as I started delving into this, I realized that there was this tremendous trove of archival materials, so rich and so deep that it was unlike anything I'd experienced in my past books. Really terrific stuff. Telegrams, the intercepts, President Wilson's love letters, the submarine commander's war log. That was very important. The detailed account of his entire patrol from the moment he left Germany to the moment he returned, including bits and pieces of narrative about being chased by destroyers and the foul weather and the lack of targets and all this stuff. Putting all these little elements together, it seemed to me, there was an opportunity to turn this into sort of an exercise in suspense. So how do you do it? Well, the first thing you do is you realize that there are two main protagonists, and that is the submarine and the Lusitania. And they are on a collision course. So right away, you have something to work with. Just by showing where they are on the same day, you're building suspense as they come closer, and that's where knowing how it ends plays into my hands, because you know how it ends, and now you see these things coming together, and it's like watching a slow motion car wreck, and that's sort of the core suspense engine. But then you play with that further by, when things are happening on a particular day, there's a thing happening on Lusitania on that day, and we know there's a thing happening on U-20 that day. We also know there's a thing happening in Washington that day, and maybe a thing happening in room 40 on or about that day. And so you have all these things starting to pace toward this end, and that's suspense.
I remember having a conversation once with a famous Canadian writer of dramatic non-fictional history, Pierre Burton, who I challenged about his use of detail, you know, the temperature, the clouds drifting through the sky, and what people thought. And the rest. How do you get around that? I mean, there has to be a certain liberty taken with detail.
Actually, no.
No?
No, actually, I totally disagree. That's why I was so drawn to this, is because the body of evidence, the body of material was so rich, so detailed, that there's no need. You have things for almost every time there's something happening on the Lusitania, you know what's happening on U-20 because it's there in the war log, you know? You have telegrams, and in some cases a telegram, I love telegrams, by the way, telegrams and intercepted wireless messages. I love them because they have their own built-in intensity and gravitas, so much so that in a couple of places I have, like I think I have one chapterlet, as I refer to it, is a single telegram. And in another place there are like 3 telegrams that form a miniature chapter. And then detail, the detail that was available on what characters did and what they experienced. The reason these characters who are in the book are in there is because they left such great stuff. If I have somebody, like in the case of Consul Frost, and I have a footnote to this effect, by the way. If I have, I have a scene where the U.S. consul in Queenstown, he is hearing rumors that something has happened, and he's seeing this unusual number of ships leaving Queenstown Harbor, and he walks to the window and takes a look out, and then later, after he learns what happened to Lusitania, he paces in his office. Now, typically, that's the kind of thing people take liberties to do. You know, it's like, well, how do you know he was pacing, right? So in fact, Frost told us he was pacing. He told us what motions he made that day. And that's the kind of stuff that, frankly, in narrative nonfiction is pure gold. So much so that I felt moved in my footnotes to say, by the way, if you're wondering how I know he was pacing in his office, it's because he told us, you know? So that really came to the fore, actually, in my book, In the Garden of Beasts, where I have, I think one of my favorite scenes in the book is where Martha Dodd, God love her, Martha Dodd goes to the room of her Soviet lover in the Soviet embassy, and there's this lovely, I just convey what was in a very, very detailed account of hers about her relationship with Boris and about that moment in the Soviet embassy, full of, like, he smiled at me, I smiled at him, he said nothing, you know, all those things that, again, somebody else might be taking liberties, but here they are, they're in her narrative of the date in the thing.
Well, she was generous to you.
She was very generous, and not just to me, may I just be frank.
And the war is a big character. The way I read your book, the major wars of the 20th century, the World War I, Lusitania happened in the middle of it. I can't read The Devil in the White City without, in my mind, you know, in retrospect, seeing a reference to what is coming down the pike, which sort of, for me, the 1893 World Fair was kind of like a pinnacle of human achievement, but it's also a kind of an end of something, isn't it? In the sense that it had this depression, this recession happening while it was on. It disappeared afterwards. The ideas survived. A lot of the technology survived, but it just seemed to me to be kind of like when you look at what's coming down 20 years later. There's a certain sadness that hangs over that story. Was that in your mind when you did it?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I mean, the World's Fair of 1893 was, in some ways, sort of a culmination of you know, it was the ultimate in civic goodwill, you know, and nothing on that par ever happened again. That was it. It was like the sine qua non of everything, you know, of art, of invention, of just really almost everything. And the way that fair ended in a conflagration, you know, fire, you know, and is just very, very much a metaphor for what was coming in the 20th century.
Again, with this book, I think, God, can they pull it off? Are they going to make the deadline? I mean, is it really going to fulfill the vision that these people had?
Talk about The Devil in the White City.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mean the quest to build a fair and then record time? Yeah. That was. I found that very compelling, and that's the suspense story in that book. You know, how is this fair ever going to get built with all the things that were happening to interfere?
It was a time, probably the last time, when there could be pure invention of self, invention of projects on that scale, and I think it's quite amazing the way you interspersed the story of Holmes, the serial killer. How many people did he kill anyway?
I've lost count.
It's somewhere between...
It's 10 years ago. I can't remember. 9, I think.
9 to 200.
Sure.
Some people
nine for sure, 9 proven, but many more suspected. Yeah.
But in the same sense that these architects and engineers could dream their dream and then make it happen, this is a guy who invented himself, as many people did in those days. You could go off and decide, I'm going to be somebody totally different, somebody awful, somebody completely wicked, or I'm going to be great. What was it about those times that contributed to that?
Yeah, what was it about those times? You know, first of all, I absolutely agree with you in terms of Holmes and reinvention and so forth. In fact, I would go so far as to say that he was heroic in a dark way. He was the dark hero, and counterpoint to Burnham's heroism on the other front. What made it that way in those times? I don't really know. One thing I can tell you is that period from 1890 to 1920 is my absolute favorite period to do history. Exactly those forces that are involved. This idea that anything was possible. This period of absolute confidence in our case in America, in the future, and this energy that said you could do anything you wanted. Mm-hmm. You could do anything you want.
And be anybody you want.
And be anybody you want.
I mean, I love the anecdote as they're about to hang Holmes, and I'm saying, it's near time. Everybody got to like the guy when he was incarcerated. And the hangman felt kind of bad about putting the noose around his neck. And what Holmes turns to the hangman and says,
"You know better than I. What does he say?"
Holmes, this awful human being who murdered women, and in some cases he stripped them down and sold their skeletons to med schools. He just enjoyed skinning people. And
who doesn't, after all?
He built this incredible killing chamber that he got away with. And as they're about to put the rope around his neck, the hangman is sort of fumbling a bit, and he says, "Take your time, old boy, there's no rush."
Yeah, no, it was a very nice exchange. It was.
One of there's this remarkable parade of people through this book too. On the Lusitania, you drop names of fascinating people. Vanderbilt, who missed out on the Titanic and disappeared on the Lusitania. One of the people that sort of flits through the wings of the stage at the World's Fair is Wilson, future President of the United States. And I thought you might have done more with him, considering his future role.
In The Devil in the White City, you thought I should have done, there were a lot of people. I couldn't do too much with all of them, But that was one of the things I loved about the World's Fair of 1893 was all the people it drew to the fair. Buffalo Bill, Wilson.
He upstaged at the World Fair.
Well, he did upstage, yeah. Just about Edison, everybody who was anybody made an appearance at the World's Fair of 1893. And it was just so magical. That too fits into what we were discussing before, this time of where everything was sort of coming together, and then everything sort of going off in a bad direction after that. Sort of very much like, I always think that's the essence of a Larry McMurtry novel, where everybody comes together, and then this sort of sad recessional as everybody goes their own ways. It's sort of
One of the great tragedies and disappointments for me was that Mark Twain showed up and didn't get to go because he got sick. Now,
I know, of all people, to not go to the World's Fair 18 is Mark Twain because he got sick and then
we
just left.
just had to know what he thought of it.
I know.
And we never would, never did.
But that was a detail that I loved, just the fact that he was there and did not go because he was sick. You know?
So Woodrow Wilson, the Princeton history professor or whatever he was, he shows up, passes through. You don't give him time of day, but he's definitely going to have a big role in your future book, in the book of the Lusitania.
Well, you know, of course, I was not thinking in terms of the Lusitania at the time, but he certainly has made it makes a big appearance in this book, and that's another thing that sort of I felt I had to bring to the picnic. Maybe another writer might not have included Wilson and his love affair. I felt it was vital.
In the Lusitania story, which was a fascinating part of it.
In the Lusitania story.
Because I think it is part of the story. I mean, a lot of his dithering may have had to do with the state of his heart.
You know, it's hard to say. He was pretty good at keeping things, you know, distinct, his work and his love life. But what I just loved, now, you know, I did not discover these love letters by any means. I mean, Wilson's biographers have known about these things. But when I came across them, what's very important is to always do fresh archival work, even though you know these things have been seen before, because they come to you fresh in a certain way. So I was in the Library of Congress going through Wilson's papers, and I came across these love letters that he wrote to his girlfriend in 1915, who eventually became his wife. And this was all on the up and up, by the way, because his first wife had died, actually, in August of 1914, after bringing to an end their marriage of many years. But when I came across these love letters, which are these are passionate love letters. There are dozens of them. And just the most amazing outpouring of passion and not lust. These are not sleazy. These are just really these passionate things. Although having read dozens of them, by the time I was done, I felt like I had to have a cigarette. You know, it's like These were amazing to me, that this man, who I typically had sort of thought of as kind of a stiff, you know, that he was writing these passionate letters to this 40-something widow that he had just sort of fallen head over heels in love with.
I'm going to shamelessly link all your three of my favorite of your books together here. Wilson played a huge role in the aftermath of World War I, and one of the things that he was determined as going to be his legacy was that there was never going to be anything like that again. And of course, as we could have told him, of course there is, especially the way you people divvied up the world. Here you have in the 30s, American ambassador, another historian, no business in the field of diplomacy, one could argue, in the most sensitive assignment in the world. He's the U.S. ambassador to Germany up until 1937, I believe. What are we to make of Ambassador, as he was known, Ambassador Dodd, whose real name was Ambassador Dodd, and his fascinating daughter and just fascinating family?
I love the way you're tying all these books together. I'm going to have publish them as a trilogy or something. You're being such a novelist, by the way. What are we to make of Ambassador Dodd? See, now my feeling is, and I don't know how many of you read the book, but it says the book is about the first American ambassador to Nazi Germany, and he was there during Hitler's rise and consolidation of power. And he was there with his daughter, Martha, who initially, on their arrival, was into the whole Nazi thing. She thought this was kind of a cool thing. What I liked about Dodd and Martha was they each expressed a certain naivete about what was going on, but from very different direction. I happen to think that Dodd may, in fact, have been just about the perfect guy to have in that job at that time. Because, what Roosevelt wanted was somebody who would stand there, stand as ambassador, stand as a model of American liberal democratic values. And Dodd took that really very literally in his very sort of quiet, staunch, North Carolina, quasi-Jimmy Stewart way. And he resisted the efforts of the Nazi hierarchy to charm him, to co-opt him, and in the end he was isolated by them because he would not give. And I think that was a very powerful thing.
Weren't American interests damaged by the behavior of his daughter? Speaking of having a cigarette.
I don't. That would be a two-cigarette number.
She was hanging out with the head of the Gestapo and the Soviet military attaché simultaneously.
I don't know that she did all that much damage to America's stature or activities in Nazi Germany at that time. Frankly, I think the Nazis were so busy doing everything else that they probably didn't even recognize that Martha was behaving badly, or else they thought she's a member of our club. This is great, Mm-hmm. But I think that she may, in fact, have provided interesting dinner table intelligence to Dodd about what was happening in Nazi Germany and helping maybe erase his or wear down his what I would call willful naivete. He was really set on deliberately not judging the Nazis. He didn't want to prejudge them. Now, that was a position that faded rather quickly, I'm glad to say, but yeah, so.
He was gone, of course, before the worst of it. I suppose I'm guilty of, retrospective hindsight, presentism, but to not convey. I mean, he was seeing what was happening. He was there when Jewish human rights were suspended, and he was there when a lot of the atrocities were happening. To not have conveyed a greater sense of urgency, would that not have played into the Western indifference to what was happening to the Jewish people throughout that period?
Well, he was in fact one of the few who ultimately sounded the alarm, especially once he was freed from the strictures of the State Department. He was really very, very direct about the threat to the Jews posed by the Nazis, and in fact went so far as to say, at one point, again, this is after leaving Germany, that it was Hitler's intent to exterminate them, and that's pretty prescient, so.
I guess I have to ask the question that you're never going to answer, but what are you working on now? I mean, what else can we expect? When I was a kid in school studying history, we never had Erik Larsons. We didn't have this kind of treatment of history, which I suppose is evidence that we should have taken history out of the hands of the historians a long, long time ago.
Well, I don't know.
I suppose you would be lost without the historians, wouldn't you?
I thank you very much for your praise on that score. But in terms of what I'm working on now, I can't tell you. No, the idea process is very, 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 very hard for me. And even though I am looking into something that has the potential to be fantastic, even though I am looking into something, I'd never talk about works in progress. It's like I'm very much one of my heroes is Ernest Hemingway, and one of the things that Hemingway wrote was that it's never a good idea to talk about work in progress because you talk the life out of it. Now that's not why, however, that the main reason I don't talk about projects.
But he also said you never stop writing until you know what you're going to write next.
Oh, did he really say that? He's one up on me.
I own about 5 watches, and I checked them all before I got here, and they were all dead. So I don't know how much time we've used up. But I know we. Yes.
Oh,
okay. I think
we're getting the hook
close.
here.
So I'm going to invite this multitude to cover the patches that I missed, and
while you're coming up to the microphone, can I just explain why I don't tell people what I'm working on, apart from Hemingway's mantra? And that is, it's not that I'm afraid somebody's going to steal my idea. It's quite the opposite. It's that I'm afraid that I'm going to tell you my idea, maybe over a beer or something, and you're going to look at me like, like, really? And the only time that I broke this rule was with somebody who's quite close to me, quite close to me, and still is. And I told this person, this person was badgering me. It's a family member, it's not my wife. This person was badgering me about what I was working on at the time, which happened to be my book, Thunderstruck. And so we were all at this sort of family thing, and I said, okay, what the hell, I'll tell her. I told her, and she says, oh, I wouldn't want to read that.
then there's the peril that I experienced where people ask and you obligingly tell them, and the manuscript ends up sitting on the corner of your office collecting dust for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I know. You say, hey, how's that book coming on the Lusitania? It's fine.
So I'm going to ask, you're going to ask a question?
Yes.
I was just curious to know if you were aware that a lot of the H.H. Holmes drama played out within a couple of blocks of this very area.
Yeah, I know about his Toronto connection.
Oh,
and you're proud of this.
I'm not very proud of it, but I was just curious because I didn't hear you mention it, and the young ladies that were disinterred that swung him at Moya Mansing were disinterred right near the corner of Bay and College Street, and the little girls are buried in St. James Cemetery just about 10 minutes walk from here.
Yeah.
So I think for the sake of the audience, a lot of people aren't aware of that. It's a very tragic and disturbing history.
Yeah, it is.
But a lot of people aren't aware that a lot of significance happened here in Toronto. So I was just wondering if you were aware.
Good. No, I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah. I wasn't even sure that we were going to go veering into Devil in White City territory. But yes. So we're going to try to bring a microphone to this one right here.
Madam?
I wonder how much truth there was in some of the rumors that the Lusitania was carrying munitions for the Allies.
Okay, so
on board the Lusitania, and that was one of the reasons it was targeted.
It was not targeted. First of all, it was not expressly targeted. Second, it definitely was carrying munitions, and openly, really, they were listed in the manifest. And it was carrying really a quite substantial amount of small arms of rifle cartridges, not arms, but rifle cartridges, some quasi-inert shrapnel shells. That's all we know for sure, but of course there was speculation that it was carrying other things smuggled on as other cargoes, and that this is what really sank the Lusitania. And I can assure you that is not the case. There may have been other secret caches of explosives and so forth aboard the ship, but that is not what caused it to sink. What caused it to sink is a lot more interesting.
That was a very good question. I was hoping to sort of get into that. I mean, there was millions of cartridges on board.
Yes.
Hi. Mr. McIntyre, I'm really glad you asked the question about detail in Mr. Larson's books, because that's always what stood out so much for me, is the exacting detail with which we're able to recreate these historical scenes. And you said that most of your scenes are sourced from historical record archives. I'm wondering if you think that there's ever an instance where you can sort of take some liberty with the imagination a bit, and to what extent you can recreate small scenes. And I think you've done this at least once in the Holmes death chamber, the one woman who left the footprint on the door.
Right.
How did you go about doing that?
So you're referring to the two little murder scenes in The Devil in the White City. And first of all, one interesting thing about the little footprint on the inside of the vault, that was fascinating. I didn't believe that at first. And then there was a news article in the Chicago Tribune from the fire department where they had found this bizarre footprint on the wall and were speculating on exactly how it came to be. And one possibility was that she had stepped in acid that he had poured under the door and had then put her foot. Anyway, so there are two scenes in Devil in the White City, and you're quite right, where what I tried to do was put people into the scenes where two women are being murdered, right? That's what you're thinking of?
Yeah.
And I wrestled with those two scenes and decided I was going to approach it this way. I really felt that there had to be some indication of what was actually happening with these killings, because otherwise everything's sort of off camera, and what was really going on? What do we know? What do we not know? So I decided then that I was going to take the approach that a prosecutor would take in a court of law. And actually, I sort of hit on this approach as I was watching a trial on court TV. I don't even know if it's still on, you know. But, you know, in a trial, in a criminal trial, the prosecutor takes the available evidence and makes a story from it that damns the defendant. The defense attorney takes the same body of evidence and uses it to exonerate the defendant. So what I decided I was going to do is going to take the known body of evidence, create my prosecutor's argument, which is essentially the two scenes, but it's going to be very transparent about it in the footnotes. Make clear that this was my approach. These are the facts that I'm using so that you can come to terms with what happened. Having said that, I have, since that book came out, I have decided that I'm not doing anything like that ever again, because it's just, I don't know, I think it worked, it was fine, and being transparent about it was really, I think, really a good thing, but it made me uncomfortable. And so, done.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. I just have a quick question. In Garden of the Beasts and Devil in the White City, you had photographs to sort of support the narrative nonfiction. Why did you choose not to do that with the Lusitania?
Yes, okay, I'm very glad you asked that question. But I'm not going to answer it. That's just right. No, I'm very glad you asked that question. So the question is, was why are there were some photographs in Garden of the Beasts, not many. But enough. Too many, from my perspective. There are no photographs in Lusitania except the ones on the cover and except the frontispiece. Here's why. I feel very strong. I'm in this business to create as rich a historical experience for the reader as I possibly can. It's like the novelist John Gardner once wrote in a book called, I believe it was On Becoming a Novelist, or it might have been his other writing book, but he wrote that he believes in creating the fictional dream, and that anything that distracts from that dream is a bad thing, be it showy writing, be it bad punctuation, bad grammar, italics, anything he felt was a bad thing. And I embraced that in my nonfiction writing. What I'm trying to produce, in a sense, is a nonfiction dream. That's not to say it's being made up, but it's a nonfiction dream. My hope is that the reader will fall into this book deeply and thoroughly, and find themselves hoping that the Lusitania will not sink, this time around. And I feel very strongly that photographs are a significant distraction to the reader. And they also, reproduction in the books this size is terrible anyway, but they're inserted in a book typically in what's referred to as a signature. It's a glossy insert, 6 pages typically. Sometimes there are 2 of these. And what happens is that these are like lighthouse beacons, begging you to pull yourself out of the story, go look and see if there's a photograph that represents whoever or whatever is being talked about, and then go back into the story. And I deeply believe that every time you pull out of a passage or a paragraph or a chapter, the risk is you won't go back. And so that's why.
Well, you do an excellent job of giving me the dream.
Good.
I read it in a day, but I immediately went and Googled because I wanted to see who was that guy, who are those people. But it was amazing. So thank you. For
Well, thank
coming.
you so much. But you see, I think you are the poster child for exactly what I'm after. You read through it in a day,
Yeah.
and then you did the smart thing. Go to Google,
Yes.
because there's so many photographs, and they'll look so much better on that high-res screen.
And there were so many photographers
Thank you,
there.
thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you. This is terrific. Thank you.
Terrific audience.